Mike, talk to Danny on the phone.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good to see you.
Frank. Good to see you.
Nice to meet you.
Wire, man.
Pleasure. Nice to see you. Let's go.
What the heck is that thing over there?
That is a Heinz 57.
It's cool. It looks like it's coming and going.
Exactly.
Your dad built that.
Yeah, and he's an engineer of some sort.
Yeah.
The biggest problems on American pickers weren't always found in the junk pile. While Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz were busy turning forgotten treasures into television gold, something else was happening behind the cameras. People who had become familiar faces started disappearing. Partnerships changed. Old relationships became strained. And the reasons were not always what fans were led to believe. So what really happened when the cameras stopped rolling? Join us as we uncover the real story behind American pickers. The disappearance nobody got a straight answer about. Frank Fritz's last episode of American Pickers aired in March 2020, and at the time, the story given to the public was a relatively simple one. He'd left the show to undergo back surgery after years of serious pain, and the plan was presumably that he'd recover and return. That's a completely reasonable thing to tell people, and for a while, it held up. He confirmed later that his spine had been so damaged it was essentially about to split in half, that surgeons put 2 rods in his back, and that he needed 185 stitches just to close the incision. Anyone who's been through a major spinal procedure knows that kind of recovery isn't quick or clean, and so fans waited. What made people start asking harder questions wasn't his absence itself, but the silence. Frank said publicly that a showrunner called him on his birthday in October of the previous year, told him he'd call back the next day, and then never did. He never heard from the production again. That's not how you treat someone who's coming back. And when Mike eventually addressed it in July 2021, it wasn't a warm update about Frank's progress. It was confirmation that Frank wouldn't be returning. Frank was replaced by Mike's brother Robbie, which was exactly the kind of move that makes a fan base immediately assume the worst about what went on behind the scenes. Actually, scratch that. They didn't need to assume. They could see it plain enough. Frank was not shy in the interviews that followed. He told The Sun that the show had become tilted toward Mike by a significant margin, that he felt he was consistently second to Mike's first, and that the two hadn't spoken in 2 years, including during the period when Frank was recovering from surgery. That last part hit fans like a ton of bricks. If someone spent over 10 years sitting next to a guy in a van and couldn't bother to call after he got spine surgery, no PR spin is fixing that. Mike dropped a statement that sounded nice on the surface, but said absolutely nothing. He claimed he cared and wanted his buddy back, then added that the guy just can't get it right, which is corporate speak for leaving a former partner on read after major back surgery. And that made the whole thing even harder to understand. Because if Mike really had stopped showing up for Frank when he needed him most, something much bigger had clearly happened between them than either man was admitting publicly. So what went so badly wrong that a friendship lasting more than a decade ended with Frank off the show, furious at Mike, and convinced his old partner had abandoned him? The reason he was actually fired. The full truth about what happened to Frank only surfaced after he died, when Mike finally opened up to People magazine. The pandemic lockdown hit both of them hard, right when things were already fragile. Frank blew out his back moving stuff around his house during quarantine, ended up on an operating table, and spiraled into opioid addiction from a brutal mix of isolation, severe pain, and heavy meds. Mike called it the perfect storm. That is actually pretty accurate. Tons of people completely fell apart during lockdown with way less on their plate than what Frank was facing. Mike admitted that he and a few others tried setting up an intervention for Frank. A month later, the two ran into each other, and Frank kept insisting he was doing totally fine, repeating it with the exact type of fake confidence that lets everyone know things are definitely not fine. Frank eventually went to rehab for drinking around that same time. He brought it up during an interview in 2021, though he tried writing it off as a past mistake that was completely behind him. The whole situation was obviously a massive disaster that neither guy wanted to talk about honestly. Repeating "I'm fine" over and over is basically the universal sign that someone is 5 seconds away from a full public breakdown. When production on American Pickers resumed after lockdown, Mike said he pushed hard to get Frank into rehab and never stopped trying. But when the network asked Frank to provide clean drug tests before returning to the show, he couldn't do it, and that's when History Channel made its decision. Mike told people that the network just finally made the decision, and that his own feelings about it were complicated. What's notable about that is Mike didn't push back against the firing, and Frank definitely noticed. He felt abandoned, and the anger in those 2021 interviews was real. The reason none of this came out at the time was, by Mike's own account, loyalty. He didn't want Frank's problems to become a public story while Frank was still alive and still trying to navigate it. He covered it up, in his words, because it wasn't his story to tell. That's either a genuinely decent impulse or a convenient justification for staying silent while Frank was out there in the press painting Mike as the villain. And probably it was both at once, because most things involving people who've known each other for 40 years tend to be more complicated than a simple good or bad reading. And that silence is exactly why Mike's explanation, even with everything we know now, doesn't completely settle the argument over who failed whom first. If Frank wasn't simply angry about losing the show, but genuinely believed Mike had pushed him aside long before the network made its decision, what did this whole breakup look like from Frank's side? What the feud looked like from Frank's side? It would be easy, given everything Mike has now said, to frame Frank entirely as someone who created his own problems and then publicly blamed his co-host for them. But Frank's version of events had some legitimate ground under it too, and the full picture requires taking both accounts seriously. Frank told interviewers that the show had become about Mike to a degree that he found genuinely demoralizing, that his contributions weren't recognized at the level they deserved, and that Mike's brother being brought in felt like a deliberate attempt to sideline him and consolidate the franchise around the Wolfe name. Friends of Frank, who later facilitated the 2023 reunion, said they never believed the two were truly feuding in a mean-spirited sense, that what had actually happened was that the separation had been long enough and painful enough that they'd lost the thread, and that both men had been keeping the other at arm's length in different ways for different reasons. Off camera, Frank was getting hit from every possible direction. The opioid overuse was just the start. He went through a messy, broken engagement, got sued by his ex-fiancée after a fireworks disaster, and was silently battling Crohn's disease the entire time. He had been living with that brutal gut condition since the 90s, kept quiet about it until 2013, and suffered through it while filming for over a decade. The medication used to treat Crohn's had weakened his bones over time, which is part of why the back injury became as severe as it did. When you layer decades of chronic illness on top of pandemic isolation and a painful surgical recovery, the picture of what Frank was dealing with stops looking like a series of bad decisions and starts looking like a person who ran out of road at a particularly brutal moment. But whatever history thought would happen once Frank was replaced, did the audience actually accept American Pickers without one half of the partnership they had spent more than a decade watching? Crazy ratings. The backlash to Frank getting fired hit hard, and the suits at the network definitely did not get the outcome they wanted. Season 23 premiered in January 2022 with Robbie Wolfe shoved into the co-host slot, and ratings immediately cratered below 1 million viewers for the first time in ages. By March, single episodes were scraping together a pathetic 830,000 viewers. Just months before the firing became public, the show easily pulled over 1.3 million per episode. That is a massive nosedive, and the executive suite definitely felt the burn. Fans were vocal about why. They weren't particularly interested in Robbie, whom most people acknowledged was probably perfectly fine, but found genuinely difficult to watch as entertainment. Comment sections on American Pickers-related posts filled up with people asking about loyalty and insisting they'd switched to watching reruns exclusively, and some organized boycotts. The general sentiment was that Mike had engineered Frank's removal to consolidate the show around himself and his family, which isn't what the evidence actually supports, but it's the story that made sense to viewers who didn't have access to the full picture. By the time Season 23 ended its run, one episode in September 2022 had fallen to 762,000 viewers, a number so low that History Channel stopped airing new episodes on their normal schedule for a stretch, which is the television equivalent of pulling a car over and sitting with your head in your hands. The ratings collapse didn't stop there. Audiences kept dumping the show season after season, eventually hitting rock bottom at a dismal 554,000 viewers in August 2023. Even the Season 26 premiere, which aired right after Frank died in September 2024, managed to scrape together a miserable 565,000 viewers. At its high point, the series was a juggernaut on cable TV. After the fallout with Frank, it turned into a ghost of its former self. Friends of Frank said straight up that the show depended on him, and kicking him out killed whatever magic it had left. So when his health took a devastating turn in the summer of 2022, was there any chance left for him and Mike to repair what had already been broken? Frank's stroke changed everything. In July 2022, Frank was found unresponsive at his home in Davenport, Iowa, and was admitted to the hospital, where doctors confirmed he'd suffered a stroke. The stroke left him wheelchair-bound and paralyzed on the right side of his body. The timeline meant that even if everything between him and Mike had somehow been resolved, even if the network had reconsidered the firing, there was now no realistic path to Frank coming back to the show. The physical reality of what he was dealing with was simply too severe. Mike posting about Frank's stroke and asking for prayers blew up in his face fast. The two weren't even talking, and Frank never said it was okay to blab about his medical business to the entire internet. Fans saw right through it. To them, it looked like a calculated move to hijack a tragic situation and play the good guy, prioritizing personal PR over the boundary of a former friend. Whether that reaction was fair is up for debate. What matters is how fast people assumed the worst. That alone shows how completely ruined Mike's reputation had become. By that point, the guy could perform an act of pure kindness, and millions of viewers would still assume it was just a fake stunt for damage control. When a guy reaches the point where saying, "get well soon," looks like an evil media scheme, the public image is beyond saving. After the stroke, friends arranged emergency guardianship to manage Frank's affairs, and a Midwest bank was eventually appointed to oversee his financial responsibilities and catalog his assets. He'd spent years building a collection and a public profile, and now the institutions around him were managing it on his behalf while he received care. A close friend of Frank's, Jerry Jandreau, told Newsweek that he believed Frank's unhappiness in his final years had genuinely contributed to his physical decline, that a person who doesn't have the will to live is at a disadvantage in ways that go beyond medical charts. By that point, Frank had lost the show, much of his independence, and years he could never really get back. But the friendship with Mike was one thing that hadn't completely disappeared, even after everything that had been said between them. So when they finally ended up in the same room again after years of distance, what did they actually have left to say to each other? The reunion that finally happened. In May 2023, over Memorial Day weekend, the two men finally saw each other again. A friend of Frank's had arranged it, and she was clear that Mike had been wanting to see Frank for a long time, but that Frank had been the one keeping his distance. When the meeting happened, both men were in tears. Mike apparently brought up their shared nervousness about one of their first major television appearances on David Letterman, and they talked about how the whole thing had started and what it had meant. The mutual friend who arranged the meeting claimed the whole feud was blown out of proportion. According to her, two old friends simply lost the ability to communicate through all the noise. She insisted they just needed space to appreciate each other again. That is a pretty boring conclusion for a feud the internet spent 2 years obsessing over. In reality, a genuine friendship collapsed under the weight of severe health issues, job stress, and the classic failure of two grown men with massive egos. Frank passed away on September 30th, 2024, at 60 years old. The official death certificate pointed to long-term complications from that 2022 stroke, along with heart disease and COPD. The very next day, Mike took to Instagram to post a tribute, writing that Frank touched people just by being himself, and claiming he was right there at the bedside when Frank died. History Channel jumped on the opportunity immediately, running a marathon of Frank's best episodes with memorial cards tacked onto the front of every single one. And Mike being there at the end gave their story a kind of closure that neither man managed to find when Frank was healthy enough for them to properly talk through everything that had gone wrong. But with Frank gone and the audience that once loved their partnership already disappearing, how much of American Pickers is really left for Mike to keep going? Where the show stands now, and what comes next? The ultimate joke in all of this is that American Pickers is technically still running. It sits in a spot nobody could have imagined back when Mike and Frank pulled in over 1.3 million viewers per episode and seemed glued to the History Channel schedule forever. By December 2025, on her 50th birthday, Danielle Colby dropped a video letting everyone know the show was finished after 27 seasons. Suddenly, she was left trying to figure out how to pay the bills without that cable network paycheck. It was a candid and somewhat chaotic announcement. Colby, who uses they/them pronouns, has been part of the show since before it was even a show, working at Mike's antique archaeology shop before the cameras arrived, and their version of the ending felt genuinely unscripted. The network immediately pushed back on it, but in that particular way, that isn't entirely reassuring. A History Channel representative confirmed to Parade that the show was still airing and wasn't officially canceled, but also acknowledged that production was currently paused and new episodes weren't being made. The phrasing was that they weren't producing new episodes right now, but could go back into production early the following year, which is about as non-committal as you can be while technically refuting a cancellation. Mike practically tripped over himself to shut down the cancellation news. He called Colby right after her video went live just to declare that the franchise is never truly over. In public, he stubbornly insists the series is alive and well. According to his spin, the sudden halt in filming is nothing but a routine scheduling choice. Supposedly, the network just has a massive pile of unreleased episodes clogging up the calendar, and executives simply prefer to dump those on television before paying for new ones. He looks entirely satisfied with this highly convenient excuse. Whether anyone else actually believes it is a totally different story. A massive, multi-year collapse in ratings usually sparks much darker conversations inside executive boardrooms. A quiet cancellation is always much easier than admitting a massive cash cow finally died of old age. What is clear is that Mike stayed busy moving pieces around the board. In April 2025, after 15 years in business, the Nashville Antique Archaeology Store closed its doors for good. Operations shifted back to the original shop in LeClaire, Iowa, where the guy's 81-year-old mother still lives. Then, in February 2026, a brand new History Channel series titled History's Greatest Picks with Mike Wolfe launched. The 8-episode run focuses on the backstory of major American historical artifacts. 5 years of pitching finally paid off, and nobody is hiding that this new show is a direct shift away from a dying franchise. After everything that came out later, do you think Mike genuinely tried to help Frank? Or do you still believe he abandoned him when Frank needed him most? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.